If I were to ask you what some of the best-selling consoles were, you'd probably give a different response depending on when you started your gaming journey. The Super Nintendo, PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360 are some to name a few, selling a combined total of 288 million units. Sales like these can be lucrative, you see, and attract companies to try their own hands at designing a console. I'm Senor Donor, and today we'll be looking at 5 of the worst-selling consoles. The first console on the list is the Apple Pippin, or the Apple Bandai Pippin, and yes, you heard me correctly. In 1994, Bandai wanted a slice of the gaming console market. They thought the Macintosh Classic 2 would be the perfect computer to base their console design on. Discussions began with Apple and both parties were able to come to an agreement. Apple would develop the motherboards, or logic boards in Apple lingo, and Bandai would manufacture the cases that would house the internal components. Apple would go on to announce their partnership with Bandai in late 1994, where the Pippin was finally revealed. 2 years later in 1996, the Pippin would be released in Japan and the United States. The Japanese version of the console was finished in white, with the United States receiving a black version, which they called the Atworld. Clearly, the employee that named this thing was on a bender the night before. Bandai spent a whopping $93 million on marketing the Pippin, forecasting sales of over 200,000 units in Japan and 300,000 units in the US within 12 months. The Pippin also cost $600 to purchase. That's expensive in 2024, let alone 1996, baby. It was also in direct competition with another console you may know. The PlayStation 1. The PS1 was a console juggernaut, as well as costing half the price of a Pippin at $300. The Pippin was discontinued in 1997 with only 42,000 units being sold. Up next is the Mattel Hyperscan. It featured a controller that resembled a third-party knockoff. You know, the type where you go to a mate's house and no one wants to use it first. The Hyperscan released in 2006 with a unique gimmick. It featured a radio frequency identification scanner that would transmit signals from a tagged item back to the console. Games for the Hyperscan were made up of a game disc accompanied by game cards referred to as IntelliCards. These held additional data that would also need to be scanned. The problem was that only 6 of these IntelliCards would come with the game, with the rest of them being purchased separately in the form of booster packs. The additional game cards would store extra characters, levels and abilities. That's right, these guys would sell you some of the game, with the rest being paid DLC. One game would set you back $20, which does sound a good deal, but to get the complete game you need to spend an additional $100 on booster packs, and that's if you're lucky, as the cards were randomized in each pack. It was discontinued a year later in 2007, with less than 30,000 units being sold. Only 5 games were ever released, with the other 2 in production being cancelled due to bad sales. The third console we'll be looking at is the Pioneer LaserActive. The LaserActive wasn't just a games console though. You could play karaoke, CDs, as well as watch Laserdisc-based media. These predated DVDs if you weren't aware. All of this sounds great, especially considering it released in 1993. So what was the problem? Well, the LaserActive unit could only play music and movies in its base form. To play games you'd need to purchase additional expansion modules called pack units. The reason this was a problem was due to the LaserActive costing $970 as a standalone unit. There were 5 additional pack units that would give you the full gaming experience, including one for Sega CDs and Genesis cartridges, NEC ROMs, karaoke titles, another that would allow control of the unit via your PC, and the 3D goggles pack unit that would work with certain games. The combined cost of the LaserActive and the 5 pack modules was approximately $3,000. If that wasn't expensive enough, some of the games were over $100 each. I couldn't imagine paying that much for a console and games in 2024, let alone in 1993. This was a key factor in why the LaserActive failed. It was simply too expensive. Only 10,000 units were ever sold, and after 3 years in the market, it was discontinued. Coming in at number 4 is the Amstrad GX4000. Amstrad was a company that specialised within the home computing market and was founded by Alan Sugar. You know, the guy that says you're fired on The Apprentice. Amstrad, like many others, wanted a slice of that console market money. They decided to base their GX4000 off their CPC Plus line of computers, with both of them set to release at the same time. The GX was announced in August 1990, releasing only a month later in Europe. The problem was that the GX utilised an 8-bit processor, whereas Sega's Mega Drive and Nintendo Super Nintendo were both powered by a 16-bit processor. Another issue was the majority of the GX's games. They were just ports from Amstrad's CPC computing line. They also jacked the price of the games up. For example, a game for the CPC would set you back $5, but the exact same game on the GX4000 would cost you $30. Amstrad also had issues with manufacturing the game cartridges, which meant it was hard for consumers to even buy games at launch. The console released at $130, which was a fair price at the time, or any time for that matter, and a marketing budget of $25 million. Unfortunately, the console only managed to sell 15,000 units. By doing some quick math and using the retail price of the console, that's just short of $2 million. That didn't even cover the marketing spend, let alone the costs of manufacturing a console. Not even a month into launch and the console was being discounted. It would be discontinued a year later in 1991. At number 5 we have the Nintendo 64 DD. The DD was a peripheral device that plugged into the extension slot of the Nintendo 64 and was seated underneath the console. The device utilised magnetic discs to be played as opposed to the regular 64 cartridges. The benefit of magnetic discs included storing more data as well as cheaper production costs. The DD included a real-time clock that would allow for a persistent state world. A persistent state world would allow the user to turn the console off, with changes still occurring in the background despite no user input. In comparison, a standard 64 cartridge could store up to 12 megabytes of data, whilst the DD's magnetic disc could store 64. Nintendo's game designer Shigesato Itoi believed they could expand on the amount of game genres with the introduction of the DD. The DD was announced in 1995 and would be fully revealed in November 1996. Nintendo stated it would launch in 1997, with sequels to Super Mario 64 and a new Zelda title being reported. The Zelda title would never release for the DD, but released on cartridge instead. You may have heard of it. It was a small title. It was only called, what was it called? The Ocarina of Time. The DD was also hampered by 2 years of delays, but was released in Japan in December 1999. The device was sold as a package that consisted of games being shipped to the customer throughout the year, as well as a 12-month internet subscription. 2 years later, it was discontinued in February 2001. Approximately 15,000 units were sold, which was a complete failure, as they originally intended to send 500,000 units to retail. The games that were set to be released on the DD were either released on the standard 64 console, which now utilised larger cartridge sizes at 64 megabytes, ported to other consoles, or cancelled entirely. Ladies and gents, subs and non-subs, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. You've heard it all a million times. All of my socials can be found in my description. And remember, I'll never be a real YouTuber until I've released an apology video. Or two. That's all, guys. Peace out.